Hey everybody, how's it going? Jenazad here. So I wanted to make this tier list today because I see a lot of tier lists around and most of them are just for content such as Tower of Adversity, but I think there's a lot of factors that go into wanting characters in Wuthering Waves. There's the overworld, there's the Tower of Adversity, and there's also the holograms, and I'm not really going to include the illusory realm because that's a little bit separate and we don't even know all the characters in that, but I kind of want to just go over all these characters. Also, some of them have really janky things in their skill sets that a lot of people don't really realize before they build them. So even if the character's decent, maybe they have something awkward about them that you don't like, or vice versa sometimes. So let's talk about all these characters, go into depth on their skill sets somewhat, and also place them on this tier list of where I think they should be. As for the 4 stars, I do place them a bit higher based on their residences. So I'm going to assume that most of the 4 stars have at least 3 or 4 residences rather than 0, right? 0 dupes, because 4 stars are generally weaker in terms of power level and damage, but most of them get a significant boost by the 3rd or 4th dupe. I think that brings them a lot more on the 5-star level, so I want to talk about that as well. Also, if you enjoy the video, please subscribe to the channel as I'm making a lot of Wuthering Waves content. So let's first start with Spectro Rover. Spectro Rover is the main character of the game. Pretty simple character. All of their attacks are very simple. Pretty good basic attack chain for parrying. They do all right damage. Their skill is also decent. Their ultimate is pretty fast to gain, does some okay damage. They have a little bit of supporting ability as well. If you look in their resonances, they have some nice stuff, like this is all guaranteed to get, right? The free 5-star, but they get some extra damage. But the really big thing right here is they actually have some healing involved. So they're a little bit of a support with that. Their outro skill right here does slow time, and it also works on bosses as well, which is a really big thing. However, the problem is they're not really buffing your damage all that much. Their healing isn't huge. The slow time is nice, and sometimes that can give you an extra damage window on certain enemies, but it's not really amazing. Their area clear is decent, decent in the overworld, decent in Tower of Adversity, but not really amazing for holograms. I would put this character as like a solid character in Wuthering Waves, and I think I would probably place the Spectro Rover somewhere around B tier overall. They're not a bad character by any means. They're just not really an amazing character. They're a decent character. One really big thing about them, however, is we can't get these final 2 dupes yet. This one gives extra damage to the ult, which is pretty nice, but this one could potentially be really good for future characters because it reduces their Spectro damage res, so that can help support a future character potentially, so maybe they're actually a little bit better when comboed with other characters. Next, we have the Havoc Rover. So Havoc Rover is a lot different from the Spectro Rover. They don't really have any supporting ability whatsoever. They're just pure DPS. They're a huge nuke DPS. They don't have any slow time or anything like that, just all damage. This character is really good at single target and AoE. They're used in almost all pieces of content in the game. They're able to easily clear packs in the overworld. In Tower of Adversity, they're really good at clearing certain floors, especially when paired with characters like Danjin to buff their damage. And they're also just really good even at boss killing for something like the hologram bosses. They're essentially a jack of all trades, and they're the main character, and you get them for free. You can only get 2 residences for free for them at the moment, but eventually when we get all of them, this character is only going to become even better. Because right now they have simple things like extra damage and this resetting the skill cooldown, but eventually you get some healing involved, which is kind of nice, reducing havoc res, which actually can potentially buff other characters such as Danjin, just doing more damage on your 5th attack, and eventually 25 crit rate, which is kind of completely insane. That's so much free stats. So this character is only going to move up in the future, but at the moment, this character is a pretty high tier character, and I think I would probably put them A tier. I don't think I would put them S tier. I think S tier is sort of like the best of the best at every single thing. They do have some downtime with some of their abilities, and sometimes they can feel a little bit janky with their skill set. They're kind of just good at everything in Wuthering Waves, the game as a whole. So I think that they deserve a really high tier overall. Next, we have Sanhua. Sanhua is probably one of the best 4 stars in Wuthering Waves. And one of the biggest reasons is that she's an amazing support because of this outro skill, Silver Snow. This gives a 38% damage amplify to the next character for all of their basic attacks. For some characters, such as Encore, that's actually a huge boost of damage. And also you have to think about the future. These are 4 stars you get right now, and in the future, they're only going to be better overall. Also, Sanhua is a pretty solid DPS, and another really big key thing about this character is she actually builds her outro skill very quickly. She's able to build the concerto gauge like almost instantly. You can swap into Sanhua, use her skill or ult if you have it, instantly use her heavy attack to dash through it, breaking it, and by then you usually have the concerto concerto meter completely full and able to swap into your next character. That's something really important for supports, is you want them on the field as little time as possible so you can get the main DPS back on the field. So Sanhua is incredibly skilled at that. Her dupes are overall decent, with mostly giving her more damage or, you know, also some of less stamina used for her abilities and things, but they're not really anything like super insane. They're helpful, but mostly just for damage for herself. You can run her as a partial main DPS as well. Some people were doing that, especially in the beta, but she's generally used as a sub DPS. However, she's definitely one of the best sub DPSs in the entire game, and I would probably put her at A tier, because when it comes down to it, she's able to get on the field, do everything that she wants, supports the team, does an okay amount of damage, instantly able to swap off to your next character, right? She has decent AoE and single target for content in the game, such as Tower of Adversity or, you know, the hologram. She's also really good at pairing, and I think that's something that's very important for certain types of content, because some characters are really awkward when they actually have to do that in the heat of the moment. So next is Jianxin. So Jianxin was a character that was overall really underrated at the start of the game, but kind of for good reason, because she's a character that isn't obviously strong. She has a lot of defensive abilities and some offensive abilities at the same time. So the big thing about Jianxin is she has this forte ability where she stands there charging, building up a shield while doing constant damage. That's kind of a problem in some of the hardest content in the game. Now, she does have this incredibly useful outro skill that increases resonance liberation damage by 38%. At the moment, there's not that many characters that actually scale hard off of resonance liberation. Like, for instance, Jiyan is off of heavy attack, or Encore is basic attack, so she doesn't combo too well with many characters other than potentially some like Havoc Rover, for instance, or possibly Calcharo. However, what's really big about this character is that her resonance liberation is a super good utility ability, taking all of the enemies in and essentially, in Genshin terms, venti ulting them, just sucking them all into a tornado so you can start AoEing them and do huge damage to them at once. Also, she does actually have some really good utility with her shield being able to also heal you. I would say that Jianxin is the most comfy character in Wuthering Waves. And what I mean by that is essentially when you're doing basic content, you feel invulnerable and you're easily able to kill elite mobs, and you're also able to easily kill like standard mobs. It's all pretty easy to kill at the same time with this character, so you don't really have to worry too much about taking damage. But if we're talking about difficult content, she can't really stand there charging her forte ability. She's just going to get completely destroyed while she's doing it. So she also doesn't build concerto energy nearly as fast as some of the other supports, which is another detriment. On hologram, she's mostly useless for the top ones because she doesn't really provide much damage. She's more of a support than a damage dealer at all, while a character like Sanhua is actually adding more damage. So a character like Jianxin is decent, but I don't really think absolutely insane for the most part for the majority of content. So for Jianxin, I would probably personally put her more around the B tier to A tier. I'm not 100% sure which I would place her, because if we think of difficult content like holograms or trying to really push the highest damage in Tower of Adversity, I think she's a lower tier. But if we talk about like usefulness in the game and how good she is at utility, being able to suck the enemies together into one spot to AoE them, and also the fact that she has utility with healing and shielding, I think that actually gives her the edge and moves her overall into the A tier. I would probably keep her around here because she's just useful in most types of content in the game, just not really like a bossing character. Next, we have Chixia, and well, I am the Chixia salesman. I am probably one of the best people to talk about when it comes to Chixia. I've used this 4-star a lot, and I believe that this character is overall incredibly useful in Wuthering Waves and very underrated. Let me explain why. So Chixia is a very underrated DPS in Wuthering Waves, and I think the big reason why is she's a 4-star. Most people don't really look at these kinds of characters. She's also free, and she also can't parry because guns are unable to parry, which is kind of a huge issue in this game actually, because that makes it a lot harder to utilize some of these characters against certain enemies because you get a lot of damage window when the boss is knocked down. Another huge issue is that she essentially has to hold down her resonance skill and sit there shooting to really get max DPS, and it can be hard to find the right times to do that and not just get attacked and interrupted before your big blast at the end. She does have a good outro skill for damage, and her ult does actually hit quite hard as well. It's actually a pretty big damage nuke. But the thing is, this character overall is hard for a lot of people to utilize because you have to find the perfect moments to attack. Now, one really big thing is she's one of the characters that gets a huge benefit from her resonances. Now, I do have her S6, of course, but 3 and 4 are the big bonuses where she actually gets a huge damage bonus from 3 and 4. They actually help her a lot when you're doing bossing. Her area clear, however, is pretty weak. Her ultimate does a lot of damage in an area and is really good for that, but other than her ultimate, she's not very good for dealing with a lot of enemies in Tower of Adversity. She's good for killing like the bosses in Tower of Adversity, especially flying enemies, because a lot of melee characters can't do much when the enemy's in the air. However, she's kind of useless when you're fighting a group of enemies, as she can only hit one at a time. And this is a big detriment for this character. It also makes it so in the overworld, she's not really an amazing farmer either. She's pretty good at the hologram bosses, and she is good at the single target bosses in the Tower of Adversity, but she's not really all that useful for just like normal basic tasks in Wuthering Waves. And it can be a little bit difficult finding the right moments to actually hit enemies with her. Also, the fact that she can't parry is a big detriment. Now, I would say she's somewhere around here. I'm of course a little bit more biased to put in her in A because I think she's an amazing damage dealer. However, I think I would probably just put her in B right now, maybe like the top of B, slightly below A, because she does have some issues that some of these other DPS characters don't have, but she is incredibly good at just a single target nuking. And also, I would say she has a better 1v1 potential versus a boss than the majority of characters in the game. She also doesn't have many characters that actually provide utility to her, which is a huge problem. Like most other big damage dealers have amazing supports, but she doesn't have one in the game yet, which kind of hurts her because Verina works with everybody, but there's no other support that really pairs with Chixia when you're using her as the main DPS. Next, let's talk about Verina. Well, let's be honest. I think most people agree Verina is one of the best characters in the game. Let me quickly talk about how Verina works though, and some things people may not quite realize. So Verina actually has some huge jankiness to her that is incredibly frustrating. When you use her swap-in intro skill, she actually remains in the air for a little bit, which is not very fun at all and actually gets you killed often. However, it is also an incredibly good parry ability. Like if you see the enemy is using an attack that you can parry, the Verina swap is incredibly good. It has basically infinite frames of parrying the entire time, so it's really easy to actually hit the boss with. But the issue is right after she hits them, she starts to appear in mid-air, and so if you're trying to swap to another character or dodge, it leaves you way more vulnerable, which is a really large problem. But aside from that, she's absolutely insane. She has this outro skill that just buffs your whole team with a huge damage boost, right? Most characters, their damage boost is only for the next character, so if you swap to another character, you lose it. Hers is just the whole team, and it lasts for a long time. She also gives a damage boost from this, and she gets to use the healing set, so you're giving such a huge amount of damage boost to your team. She's just easily one of the best characters in the entire game in Wuthering Waves. I'm gonna be honest, it's pretty obvious she's S tier. I think pretty much everyone agrees. Every single team anyone wants to run always has Verina on it. She's able to instantly build up her concerto meter pretty much immediately. Like if you swap in, do a few attacks, use skill, bam, you already can use the outro skill. Like she's so fast, it's insane. Other supports usually have to remain on the field or have more technical stuff. She's so dumb and easy to use that she's able to just immediately build it up. Also, one other big thing about Verina that a lot of people don't realize is her ult can actually parry, which is interesting. The moment when it zooms in on Verina and she does a little animation, it actually parries, which is interesting. She has a few parries built in. She can do it with her basic attacks, and she can also do it with her skill, and learning that could actually be really useful tech on Verina. So there is like some high skill cap stuff you can do with her if you really want to get down into the nitty gritty. Next, let's talk about Alto. Oh boy, now Alto is a character that I actually have a lot to say about because I wanted to try him out, but there are some big issues with him, and it's not damage. It's not what a lot of people realize. So here's the thing with Alto. He is probably one of the most fun characters in Wuthering Waves that I've seen. He has this interesting mechanic where every 4 attacks he does, basic attacks, or his skill, creates a portal in front of him. When you run into that portal, you turn into like a wisp that moves super fast and shoots off bullets. And also if you shoot through the portal, you're doing extra damage. One of the really big things about him too is when you have his third resonance, every time he shoots through the portal with his normal attack, he shoots 2 extra bullets that both do 50% damage. So he's doing like twice the amount of damage, right? Which is super interesting and fun, right? But there is one giant flaw with this character, and it's not the damage. If you try to dodge while a portal's nearby, so you turn into the little wisp, for a moment after you dodge, when you're entering the portal and when you're exiting out of that form, you do not have any invincibility frames. That means if you were trying to dodge a boss or an attack and a portal's nearby and you dodge into the portal and it has a decently big hitbox, you just get hit and die. That is a huge issue with this character. It fundamentally makes him almost useless in most boss fights. It actually, like, I really tried to make it feel decent or work, but he's moving around so much in boss fights, you'll inevitably go into one when you don't really want to, and it makes you feel really awkward, especially when you're doing hologram bosses or smaller arenas. It makes him really hard to use, right? Also, his damage is bad. He is definitely on the lower end of damage in Wuthering Waves. That's another really big issue. However, he does have some decent things about it. First of all, he is actually an arrow damage amplifier, so if you're not using Mortefi for Jiyan, for instance, he actually works out pretty well, which is pretty nice. Also, he ult makes a portal essentially that you shoot through for more damage. That actually combos with other gun characters, I believe. So he is sort of like a support DPS in a lot of ways. He also has this really interesting thing on his skill where he actually makes a clone, and that clone takes any aggro, including bosses. I was trying it out a lot, and if you use it, even like some of the hardest bosses like level 90 Morning Ikes just starts wailing on the clone, which is kind of insane that you're actually able to do that. Maybe if you had a party of 3 Altos, you could just permanently have the clone out and the enemy would never ever attack one of you. Maybe that's completely overpowered, I don't know. But I do feel like Alto has some nice supporting utility, but he's just not really quite there, and he doesn't work as a main DPS because of that dodge deficiency. Overall, I would probably put Alto down here at, I think I'm gonna say C tier, because he does have important utility like the arrow damage and stuff, and he may have future use, but he's just not really worth it for the majority of players. Next we have Jiyan, and oh boy, well, this is the first limited character in Wuthering Waves. His banner's going away really soon. Jiyan is considered probably one of the best DPS overall. There's some things we definitely have to mention about this character though. So one of the biggest things about Jiyan is he is so easy to play. It's like kind of a meme how easy he is to play. People joke about being blindfolded playing this character because he is so good at parrying while his ult is running that you literally just hold down the attack button, target the enemy, and you just wait for it to run its course if the enemy is using any parry attacks. Like when you're fighting something that does constant parryable attacks like Mephis, he's just brain dead, right? He's a really easy to use character, and that's something that's really good to have in the game, especially as the first character, because he's not very technical, you don't have to do crazy things, but he has some really useful stuff in his skill set, and I would say a couple problems. Also, one thing I want to mention, that if you do have all of his resonances, he is the most broken character in the entire game. So if you're a whale, I have seen his ultimate, just the initial hit alone, basically one-shot some of the hardest bosses in the game. He hits for like 600,000. Absolutely ridiculous if you actually have all of his damage amplified and buffed up, and then you have Resonance 6. He's the most broken thing we've ever seen in this game so far. So what are the really cool things and bad things about Jiyan? Well, he's easy to play and he's high damage. He also combos amazing with characters like Mortefi and Verina. He's good at basically every piece of content in the entire game. He's good at Tower of Adversity because he has amazing AoE. He's pretty good at single target too, so he's not only good at the bosses in Tower of Adversity, but he's also good at some of the hologram bosses, and also he's good at parrying, which makes him really good against them too. So he's kind of just good at everything, right? And in the overworld, he's also good at just clearing mobs really quickly. He has good damage, he has good AoE, he's easy to play, kind of just the jack of all trades character. I will say, however, there is one giant flaw with this character, and anyone who's used him, I'm sure, has noticed. When he is ulting, for some reason the camera becomes completely locked and you can't move it. It does not track enemies. That was in both betas, by the way, and they never fixed it. I really hope they fix that camera glitch as fast as possible, because Lackey 2 is really screwing it up. Every time you ult, you like basically can't see anything, and then if the boss teleports or like moves somewhere else, you literally can't see anything and you will just die. But you know, that's the bright side of Jiyan. Sometimes I can't see the boss, but I parry their attack anyways. So that's pretty nice about Jiyan, right? So overall, I think Jiyan is kind of an S tier character. He's essentially good at every piece of content in Wuthering Waves. He's a joke to use. He's so simple, and I think everyone can kind of have fun with this character. And I think that's very important, is he's brain dead easy and doesn't really have any super complicated things about him. But that's kind of the beauty of him, is a lot of other characters are more complicated and don't have as much ease of use. He's perfect for a lot of people to play, and he's just easy to go in and have fun with. And I think that actually is important in this game. He is probably the overall most useful DPS in the game to have right now. However, keep in mind, in the future, characters will get outscaled because there is power creep in every gacha game ever made. And some people do find it boring how easy it is to play as well. Next, we have Danjin. Danjin is probably one of the hardest to use characters because she uses her own health to attack. So essentially, you're always going to be at 1 HP. However, you feel like an absolute badass doing it. She is easily one of the highest damage dealers among 4 stars. because she has this detriment. She's permanently at 1 health, but she hits really hard. She's also really easy to parry with, and that's something that's actually really important because against some of these bosses, some of the really challenging ones, she's just a constant wall of attacks. She attacks so quickly, so you can easily get your attacks off and either parry or dodge whenever you need to, and then go back into a combo. She doesn't really feel awkward to use whatsoever. Her resonances are also insanely strong. Some characters have fairly weak resonances, but I've found almost every single one of Danjin's is giving you a nice damage boost. When you have her 4th or 5th one, she also is getting a huge boost of damage that really helps this character. So she can easily be used as your main damage dealer, but she also combos with characters like Havoc Rover. She also has this really useful outro skill that gives 23% Havoc damage amplify, which is good for Havoc Rover or any future characters. So she's weirdly a support at the same time as she is a DPS. In the future, maybe we'll have more double main DPS teams, and she perfectly fits into that, but she is very difficult to use. Now, what are the really big detriments? Well, in the overworld, you are not going to use this character. When you're farming echoes in the overworld, it sucks because you're going to be at 1 HP fighting groups of enemies, and you're just going to die. It happens to everybody. You're careless for a second and you die. You don't really want to sweat that hard in the overworld and like be perfectly managing, dodge everything, attack everything when you're just doing casual farming, and that's a little bit of a problem with this character. However, I will say in Tower of Adversity, she's very good at bossing. She's not insanely good at dealing with packs though. She's okay with AoE, but she's not good at actually grouping them together. And her ult has AoE damage, but she's not really amazing for that kind of thing. She's also really good at 1v1 bossing though, and she's perfect for cool YouTube 360 no-scope showcases and all that kind of thing. We're like, I 1v1 this boss with Danjin. She's incredibly good at that, and when you're really focused and you know all the enemy's patterns and attacks, you can look like a pro and you can do it hitless and do a ton of damage really quickly. She was one of the most popular characters in the beta to use because she was one of the only ones that could actually out DPS some of these enemies' timers. Overall, I think Danjin is in a similar boat to Chixia, where she's a really solid DPS. Her and Chixia are both very good DPS to use, but they do have some downsides compared to some of the other 5 stars, especially Danjin requiring a high skill cap compared to almost every single one of these characters where you literally cannot be hit. Right? If we're talking pure damage 1v1 potential, her and Chixia would easily be A to S. But if we're just talking in terms of like overall content in the game, I don't really think that this character is overall as high as some of the others. But she does combo, however, with Havoc Rover. And you know what? Actually thinking about that right now, with the fact that she gives the damage boost, you know what? Never mind. I'm moving her up to A. I think she's actually better than Chixia. Chixia is my main character and I use her a lot. However, Danjin provides the extra support of the 23% Havoc deepen to the Rover, and I believe that alone makes her a higher tier. She's also going to be used in the double Dreamless team comp that a lot of people utilize, where you use Havoc Rover's ult into Dreamless and to swap to Danjin into Dreamless, and I think because of that, she is overall better as a team player character as well, but she does have a lot of difficulty to play. Next, let's talk about Encore. So, Encore is overall considered probably to be one of the main DPS that people are using in Wuthering Waves. Encore is pretty good at overall most of the content in Wuthering Waves. However, I do think that she has a few things that she has some issues with or a little bit janky. First of all, she's very hard to parry with. So people who use her type of weapon, the like mage-like weapon, what is it called? Rectifier. The Rectifier users are a little bit awkward to parry with. Her first and second attacks in her attack string cannot parry, but her third attack can parry. Also, her jump attack can parry, and her intro skill can parry. So it's a little bit weird trying to sometimes parry on Encore. However, when she's ulting, she becomes a parry machine, attacking so quickly, which is really good. Another thing that's a little bit awkward is her resonance skill. So she sits there shooting a bunch of fireballs at the enemy, and at the end, she does like a final powerful fireball. Now the problem with that is when you do that final fireball attack, you can't actually dodge out of it. So if you're just using it and then the enemy goes for an attack and you already started using the final fireball, you just get hit and there's nothing you could do. Most attacks in this game, you're easily able to cancel out of, but that's something that's a little bit awkward about Encore that I think makes it a little bit harder to utilize her. Another thing that a lot of people find hard to use is her Forte circuit. It is overall simple once you actually understand. You're supposed to use her heavy attack, then swap to another character, and you're getting a lot of damage out of it, but this definitely makes it harder for newer people to use, and also some people accidentally just use the heavy attack and then don't realize they're doing that and then get hit by something. She requires a lot more technical ability if you really want to play her optimally as well, with a lot of like swap techs and like doing all sorts of stuff. Like you're supposed to use Encore's skill, swap to another character, do those attacks, then swap back to her for the final attack, but this makes it a little more sweaty to use her. You have to be faster, but she does actually do huge amounts of damage. She's overall good at pretty much every every piece of content in the game. She's good at Tower of Adversity. She has decent AoE, but also good single target damage. She's good at holograms because she just does a lot of damage. Also, the fact that she's partially ranged can keep you at a better distance versus some of the bosses. And with her skill, she can actually, I believe, hit airborne targets as well, which is really good. So she's kind of just useful in most pieces of content. However, because Encore requires a little bit more effort to use than other characters, I do think that I would put her more towards the A tier. She's a little bit janky when it comes to pairing, and you have to do a lot of the swap tech. She's really good in quick swap teams where you're constantly swapping between your entire team and characters. However, she does require a lot more effort for that stuff, and she doesn't have as much AoE as some of these other characters as well, so I believe she's more of an A tier character. I would say her and Havoc Rover, from what I've seen, are overall pretty similar in just terms of the overall damage output people are actually doing with these characters, and they're overall really good, but I don't really think they reach the level of just like brainlessness that Jiyan brings to the table. This is something that Jiyan excels in, is you could have a lobotomy and you can still play him perfectly, while Encore requires a lot more effort to do that same thing that he's able to output. And so I believe because of that, these characters just aren't really on the same level as this lobotomite Jiyan. Next, let's talk about Taoqi. So Taoqi is considered by a lot of people to be really bad, and there's a few reasons for that, but there are some actual big upsides about this character that some people don't exactly mention, and we'll have to see what happens in the future. So already when you look at Taoqi, she looks good, right? You got that going for her, but she has more than just two big problems. So one of the big issues with this character is that her skill is a little bit awkward to use and has a long cooldown. Also, to really get the full use out of her, you have to do her heavy attack and get hit and then go into multiple strikes. She feels very awkward to use most of the time, and a lot of people aren't really able to do much damage with her, and it's not really providing a lot of utility, which is kind of a huge problem, because in this game, damage is king. People don't really care about tankiness for the most part, so her shield and defense scaling and all that utility just doesn't really matter much to the majority of players. Now, she does have one thing that I think is actually really significant. She has the only resonance skill damage amplify out of every character in the game. Now, on paper, that's really good, but there's almost no characters in Wuthering Waves that actually care about this. I would say the only one that truly cares is Chixia, because the majority of her damage is resonance skill. But the majority of characters aren't really using this, so maybe in the future, certain characters would get huge buffs with this. But there's another really big problem with Taoqi. She builds the Calcharo meter pretty slowly compared to other characters. The most important thing for a support or sub DPS is to build the Calcharo meter immediately. You enter in the field, do a super quick thing, then you get your outro skill, swap to the next character, give them the buff. She doesn't really have that. She is way too slow at building that gauge. And because of that, it really hurts her usability. It really, really does. She basically doesn't have much damage, not a bunch of utility, and she's a bit awkward to use. Overall, I don't really think that Taoqi is an amazing character. She has future potential, but at the moment, I really just have so little faith in the character, because if she built up the Calcharo meter immediately, I would place her higher. But at the moment, I would probably put her in D tier, and that's not just to explain how she looks, right? That's we're not talking about that. I just think overall, she's not really an amazing character, and I wouldn't place her that high. Next, let's talk about Yinlin. So Yinlin is the second limited character in Wuthering Waves, and a lot of people are debating, who should I be pulling? Should I be pulling Jiyan, or should I be pulling Yinlin? She is definitely more attractive than Jiyan, and that's a huge plus for someone like me. But if we're talking more gameplay wise, I don't believe either of the limited characters are must-haves, even though they are very good characters. Now, what does Yinlin really bring to the table? She is a very good damage dealer support for a couple of reasons. She is the only damage dealer support that's actually doing damage while off-field constantly. She puts the mark on the enemy, she activates it, she swaps to your next character, and then the enemy's constantly taking damage from her lightning. There's not really any other character that's providing that level of on-field support that she is. Also, she is the strategist right here, giving you electro damage and resonance liberation damage. Absolutely insane on characters like Calcharo. Even characters that don't scale with electro, she's still giving some resonance liberation damage to them, so someone such as Havoc Rover is still getting a really nice bonus overall, which is really useful. She has pretty high damage, but a lot of the issue that people have is she's not a main DPS, she's a sub DPS. So that's something a lot of people have to keep in mind. And she's also a bit difficult to play, because to ideally play her, you need to do a lot of quick swapping where you're doing some attacks and merely swapping to another character to cancel her animation but keep the attack on the field. And that's something a lot of people aren't very good at or need to learn. Yinlin's dupes are also absolutely insane. If you get all of the dupes, she does become a main DPS. However, they are nowhere near the level of Jiyan. I believe if you have all of her dupes, she's doing like way less damage than Jiyan as a whole, but she is a really solid just damage dealer and nuker and support for the team. Another really big thing about Yinlin is she is way more future-proof than some of these other characters. Supports always last longer than DPS in every single gacha game. Supports usually aren't invalidated as quickly. The next time an arrowed main DPS comes out, it might just be better than Jiyan. But the next time any Electro characters come out, she might pair well with them. Because of all this, I do think that Yinlin actually gets a really nice boost. She is not a must-pull by any means, but because of the future-proofing and the fact that right now she is one of the best damage dealer supports for most characters, and unless you need a specific one such as, let's say, Mortefi, she's just overall a jack of all trades and really good DPS, and she's good at area clear, she's good at single target damage as well. In hologram, she provides a lot of good damage. In Tower of Adversity, she is good area clear, marking all the enemies, making them constantly take damage, but also good versus the single target boss to quick swap into. I think that really gives her a huge amount of potential. She's also pretty good at parrying. A character like Encore has a lot of issues with parrying, however, Yinlin is basically just better than her in every way when it comes to parrying, because her initial attack parries and her jump attack is better than Encore's as well for parries. So I believe because of all of these reasons, Yinlin actually deserves to be in the S tier up with Jiyan. And you might say, okay, well, they're both limited characters, duh, they made them insane. However, you have to keep in mind that even though these characters are S tier, they're not that much better than the characters in A tier, right? I will say Verina is a cut above most other supports, but I do believe these two characters are kind of at the peak right now overall in terms of usefulness to have for a lot of players. Next, let's talk about Mortefi. So Mortefi is a 4-star that I think a lot of people are huge fans of. So Mortefi is really good at supporting one character in particular, Jiyan. I think most people would agree that he is the best Jiyan support character in the game. However, there's not a lot of other characters that he really supports, right? Because his big thing is that he is giving heavy attack damage, and Jiyan, all of his damage is heavy attack damage. But how many other characters are really getting that much out of it? Maybe a little bit of Jianxin charge attack, but she's more of a support as well. Now, one of the really big things is that his Resonance Liberation actually hits pretty hard. If you actually build him, he is contributing a large amount of damage. Characters like Sanhua do the quick swap, do a bit of damage, and the big thing is to get the outro skill, but Mortefi does that, but then he's still doing a bunch of damage after he's left the field with his ult, similar to someone like Yinlin, which is actually really strong. That's not really something that you can underrate. Also, another really big thing about him is he's almost able to double the duration of his ult when you get his 4th resonance. This is huge. So if you actually build him with damage, his ult is contributing a pretty large amount because it goes from 10 seconds, I believe, to 17 seconds, which is kind of crazy. So his dupes can actually be really significant for him as a sub damage dealer for your team. Another really big thing about Mortefi is he builds the concerto meter pretty darn quickly. I don't think as fast as a character like Sanhua, but you could also throughout a fight just quickly swap to him, do a gunshot, do his skill, swap back to somebody else. He's ranged, so he's also able to easily be swapped in to be used when the boss is either farther away or doing an attack like in the air or something. So you can easily swap to him and build up the concerto meter and use his skills. And he's overall just a very simple to use character, and you can easily use him with Jiyan as well. But he doesn't really pair with too many other characters. At the moment, I'm not 100% sure if I want to put Mortefi in A tier, because I do believe that some of these other characters give more utility, and even though his ult is really good utility for the team in terms of damage, he only really buffs Jiyan. You're not really going to see many people use Mortefi with anyone else, unless they want to pair it with Danjin's heavy attack because it hits pretty hard, or they just really like Mortefi. I don't believe he gives the same level of support as a character like Sanhua. He also doesn't really have the same level of area clear or being able to group enemies as Jianxin, which I think is a little bit of a problem as well. So I just wouldn't really place him as high as some of these other characters, even though he is a really solid DPS. Keep in mind, the characters in B tier are not bad. I've used Chixia to be able to clear every single boss in in the entire game. Even though this is where I'd place the characters in terms of their overall strength level, Mortefi is not a bad character by any means. I just don't think he's as useful. On the overworld as well, you're not really going to be using a ton of Mortefi to do clear of enemies for echoes. You're more using him on the really difficult sweaty content like Tower of Adversity or the hologram bosses to get maximized damage on certain characters with his outro skill. And because of that, I just don't think he really is as high as some of these other characters. Next, let's talk about Calcharo, or Calcharo, Kakarot, whatever the hell you want to call him. He's probably one of the most popular characters in Wuthering Waves because he is one of the biggest badasses we've seen. Genshin could never. Calcharo not only looks like Sephiroth, but he's also voiced by Sephiroth. Now, he is one of the top damage dealers in Wuthering Waves, however, he does actually have a few issues that we can talk about. One of the first issues that I want to talk about is whoever made this second upgrade here is an insane person. This has got to be the most trash upgrade ever. Most characters at level 70 get a good upgrade. This is literally worthless. So he actually gets less power at level 70 than probably every other character in the entire game. However, he does pair with Yinlin, which is a really big boost. Now, one of the big things about Calcharo is he's actually hard to play. A lot of people going into him when they decide to start the game and they're like, I want to play Calcharo, they don't realize that he actually requires more work than a lot of other characters. He's harder to parry with than most other characters. His attacks are a little bit slow and a little bit awkward. He also requires a little bit of like animation canceling where you want to go like attack skill, attack skill, attack skill, or you could just go for the simple thing of skill, skill, skill. You don't really have to every time. But another really big thing is you don't really want your attacks to be interrupted. And that's a big issue with his ult, because with his ult, you basically want to non-stop spam your attacks at all times. And sometimes that gets interrupted with certain enemy attack patterns or other issues like that, which he can lose just all of his DPS on because he does so much damage during his Resonance Liberation. It's his main DPS. Also, one of his animations takes so long. His heavy attack, he does a heavy attack into a ground slam right after. That's something that's really important that a lot of people have to do, is they have to animation cancel it because it's so strong and does so much damage. The moment you start it, you have to swap to another character, do their skill or whatever, then swap back to Calcharo because the animation took so long, you're able to make it back in time by the time he lands, right? And because of all these technical things, a lot of players aren't able to really play him correctly and they have a lot of difficulty. To really maximize his damage, you need perfect damage windows on the bosses, and some of them don't really give you that. Also, let's talk about overall Tower of Adversity. He's decent at area clear, but he's not really absolutely insane at it. He's good when enemies are relatively close by to each other, but he's not really good if the enemies are overall kind of farther or not really like disjointed with some space in between. He's more of a single target damage dealer at that point. However, he pairs so well with Yinlin that she actually helps him a lot with that deficiency. Overall, Calcharo is one of the biggest nukes in the game, but he's very similar to Encore in terms of there's more technical things you have to know. I would consider Calcharo to probably be the hardest main DPS in the game to play. I think I would probably put him in A tier overall. I'll just put him right up by Encore, just because. But overall, I believe that he is one of the most technical characters to play, and they actually made him easier from the beta. In the beta, there was a lot more swap canceling you had to do, and it may have really pissed people off. So they actually simplified him more once the game launched, which is a bit of a shame in some ways, but he's high skill cap, high reward, but I don't think he rewards as high as the little bottomite Jiyan over here. Next, let's talk about the GOAT, Yuanwu. Now, I get told to build this character every 3 seconds, and well, I've actually tried him out a fair bit on some of the bossing. How good is this character really? Well, after trying out this Discord mod looking guy with his fedora, I think that Yuanwu is not very good. There are a few huge issues with him. One, he is a weirdly attack and defense scaling character. He mostly scales all off of defense. However, there aren't really good weapons for defense scalers because it always gives flat attack, and then sure, you can get defense percent, but it's not really all that good. Also, defense is kind of a useless stat unless it's all converted to damage because you don't really care about tanking. Now, another thing is his damage is just not that high. The Yuanwu that I actually tried was Resonance 5 on another person's account, level 70, 250 crit damage, like 60 crit rate, all that jazz. His damage was not really that good. And now a lot of people will say, well, he's not meant for damage. He's a support. Okay, fair. Yuanwu is a support. Now, what is he really contributing to your team as a support? Well, his resonance skill is doing a grand total of 4% coordinated attack damage. Huge number. amazing. It's almost unnoticeable most of the time. And his outro skill, it reduces their vibration strength by more. It doesn't give a damage boost to the next character, it does more of the enemy's stagger gauge, which is good. And when I tried it against some of the bosses, I noticed I could knock the boss down on its knees one more time approximately by using him. However, I would rather just get a giant damage boost from someone like Sanhua, Mortefi, or like just a percentage havoc boost from someone like Danjin than being able to potentially break the bar of the boss like one extra time. It's not really that amazing. The fact that his damage is low, his utility is kind of low, I just don't feel he really has much place in the game. He's not very good for AoE all in all, and his single target isn't really that amazing either, so I don't really think he's good in Tower of Adversity. He's not very good against the hologram bosses, and he's not very good for overworld clear either. Now I will say he has one really big benefit, in that he actually attacks so fast and he's constantly throwing out blows that he's able to really easily parry with your brain turned off. If you just mash his attack, you're gonna parry like 90% of what the enemy's throwing at you, which is pretty cool actually. But I just don't think that Yuanwu really has much place in the game. Now, overall, just from my testing, I think Yuanwu is somewhere around D tier as well. I think D tier are just characters that are not really fully realized. There's not really characters that they support well enough, and they just don't really contribute enough to the current roster of the game. In the future, maybe there will be a character that scales really well with him, but I just don't really think that he's all that great. And it's the same with Taoqi. Even though she can buff resonant skill damage, not enough characters really scale with that for her to be all that good in the game at the moment. Next, let's talk about best boy here. Everybody loves Lingyang. The amount of people I've heard quit this game or reroll accounts purely off of getting Lingyang is so impressive. He deserves an S tier just for being a roach, apparently. Oh boy, here he is, everyone's favorite Lingyang. Now, if we're talking purely gameplay design, Lingyang has some ups and some downs. Now, one of the big ups with Lingyang is that he actually attacks very quickly, which is really useful for parrying. And he actually does a pretty decent amount of damage. A lot of people refuse to even test him purely based off the way he looks or because of his story, but his damage is actually pretty solid, and almost nobody knows that because they refuse to ever touch this character. Now, what is the really big cool thing about him? His forte circuit. Once you've built it up, he goes on the drums, he starts dancing around, he's airborne. However, even though he's doing a good amount of damage, there's some really huge issues with this character. One of them being when he's in the air, he's pretty vulnerable. He kind of wants to just get his full combo off in the air, but usually you constantly have to be dodging around, and it makes him kind of awkward to utilize with his airborne combat. Now, one really big benefit is he's actually able to hit some airborne enemies, so when they're flying up, he's in the air too, and he's able to punch them, which is pretty cool for a melee character. But simultaneously, he's actually bad at killing some of the smaller enemies. A normal human-sized enemy for Lingyang, sometimes he'll miss some of his attacks because he's far in the air and he's doing all these flips and crazy things, and he just can't really track them that well. And so sometimes he'll just miss his attacks, which is pretty bad. And if we're talking like really small enemies, like really short and tiny enemies, he can just miss them altogether because he's flying so high on the drums. So just from a gameplay perspective and gameplay design, he has some problems there, even though his damage is really solid. Almost nobody wants to use him, half gameplay design and half just the way he looks. Another thing about Lingyang is he's not really good for AoE at all. He is able to use a good AoE echo, the ice one, but he doesn't really deal with packs of enemies all that amazingly. As for single target, he's decent on a one-on-one, and he's able to easily parry some of the hard bosses, but he's just not really amazing as a DPS compared to some of these others. So for Tower of Adversity and Hologram, he's not really like the top. He's not really at the peak. And for just overall world clearing, he's also not really amazing as well. Another thing, just an aside, is that when he doesn't have his forte gauge, I don't think he's very fun for a lot of people, because the whole point of this character is basically just building up this bar until you get to actually pop off. But then anytime the bar is not there, you kind of just feel like a second-class citizen on Lingyang, and it doesn't feel very good. One benefit is that he does do a good amount of damage on his outro skill, but it is similar to Havoc Rover, Encore, Chixia. There's a lot of other characters that do this kind of nuke damage on their outro, so he isn't really all that unique. Overall, I would probably probably place Lingyang somewhere around a C, because I just don't really think he brings enough to the table as a main DPS to warrant actually utilizing him. In the future, maybe he'll combo with some other things and be better, or maybe they'll kind of fix a little bit how he plays, but I don't think he's as amazing as some of these other DPS. And when I just compare him to, for instance, a character like Chixia, he's just doing less damage and he has less damage opportunities and windows, and it just makes him awkward to play. Next, let's talk about Baizhi, and there's one question that I have to pose to everybody here. Why in the world did they not swap Verina's design and Baizhi's design? I will be asking that until the end of time, because then I would actually want to use Verina if she looked like Baizhi. What were they thinking? All right. Here is Baizhi, probably one of the best looking characters to me, and she is also one of the other big healers similar to Verina. Now, a lot of people do not use this character, and I think a lot of people don't really respect them as much either. But this character is actually better than a lot of people think. So she also has a damage amplification just like Verina, and a lot of people misread this, but she constantly heals the next person for 30 seconds, and that is buffing their damage. Now, the issue is I believe she only heals the next incoming character. So that means if you swap to another character, you lose the healing, meaning you lose the damage amplification. So this means overall she has less uptime than a character like Verina. Also, she builds up the Calcharo meter much slower than Verina. Verina builds it up basically instantly, which is incredibly good. Baizhi, she's a little bit of a slow starter. Also, another really big thing with this character is that she's more about healing. Most of the stuff related to her is all about like healing or benefiting the team, except for this, which gives a 15% attack boost, very similar to Verina, also on the first ability. But also if you look at her resonances, she's mostly just about healing or like helping the team, but she does have a couple big utility things a lot of people don't realize. She does actually buff the Glacio damage at R6. Now, obviously R6 requires a lot, but maybe in the future, she might actually become the ideal support for certain Glacio type units. We'll have to see. She is also, I believe, the only HP scaler in the entire game, which is kind of interesting. That makes it so at least there's some use for HP gear at the moment. We'll have to see in the future what happens with that. She's a solid support, but just not really quite as good as Verina, but I think a lot of people underrate how useful Baizhi really is. If you use somewhere like Illusory Realm, you'll see her as a main DPS and she's incredibly fun, but she's really just a simple support like Verina. You're not trying to do any damage, and even though Verina outshines her, Baizhi is usually a really good character to have as the secondary support on your other team for something like Tower of Adversity. Because of that, I think she's very good in Tower of Adversity. She's solid for holograms if you don't have someone like Verina, of course, or if you're tired of your Verina constantly appearing in the air after intro skill and getting you killed, and she's just an all-around solid character in Wuthering Waves. Because of all this, I feel as though Baizhi is honestly around the A tier when it comes to supports. I think a lot of people really underrate this character. She's constantly able to heal your team, which is nice for just overworld clearing because you're inevitably just going to take some damage or get hit by things. She's a really solid character to have Tower Adversity because she's able to buff your team, and she may have some future use with that Glacio damage boost as well. Also, her design is really good for a 4-star, right? She also actually, I believe, is able to parry with some of her rectifier attacks, although I don't use the character enough with her normal attacks to quite remember exactly which ones are able to parry. Next, let's talk about the mascot of Wuthering Waves, Yangyang, or I guess Rexlent you could say right here. This character is pretty overlooked, and I think most people really don't care to use this character. They've never tried her really. They don't really utilize her whatsoever. So I've tried Yangyang a little bit, not the level 5 Yangyang here, of course, and I think that Yangyang actually has a little bit more utility than people realize, but she's a different type of utility than a lot of people know. So the big thing about Yangyang is that she isn't giving you damage, but she's giving you resonance energy for the next character, so able to give them ult more. Now, at the moment, there's not many characters that really need that type of thing, but she also has a secondary utility of being able to gather up the enemies. She's able to make like tornadoes that suck in the enemies, which is really useful. It's very similar to a character like Jianxin, which is really good in content like the tower. So the fact that she has the utility ability of being able to gather enemies and then also give energy to the next character's ult makes it so that she could be a pretty good combo piece. Potentially with certain rotations as well, I think that she may have the ability to actually fit in perfectly for getting characters ults at the perfect moment. Another really big thing that I think people underrate is her resonances, and this is important because she's generally a support and doesn't really do much damage. However, if you look at some of these, it paints a different picture. Look at her 5th one. Her ult's damage gets increased by 85%. That's kind of an insane boost for her ultimate damage. That actually makes it do a significant amount. And if you look at some of these others, Feather Release mid-air by 95%. That's her 2nd heavy attack that she does while she's in the air and then comes down. That just doubles its damage, I believe. I don't know why they didn't do 100%, by the way. Just add the extra 5, please. But I think if you actually have her resonances, she becomes a little bit more than just a support and actually becomes more of a sub DPS, similar to a character like Sanhua. I think the fact that she also is able to gather up enemies is pretty decent as well. However, she's not really an amazing support because she doesn't give any damage boosts whatsoever. I believe her last resonance might, yeah, she does give a 20% attack boost, but it's just not really anything absolutely insane for her. So that makes her way weaker than some of these characters like Verina, for instance. Now, I think I probably would place a character like Yangyang. I'm really debating between B or C tier because I feel as though she's not on the same level as some of these characters, and she's a little more difficult to use with some of her heavy attacks. I think that she's okay on the overworld, but not really someone you would use. For things like holograms, she's not really your first choice either, and she's not really an amazing character in Tower of Adversity. Her gathering mechanic is really good, but you're really trying to push the clock in that game mode and do more damage, and because of that, I think I would put her in C tier. If she actually gave a damage boost to the team, I think she would be an easy B to potentially A as well, but potentially she would move higher as people start to learn more about the game and realize, oh, you actually need this ult battery for these certain kind of rotations, maybe in the future, but at the moment, she doesn't feel fully realized in Wuthering Waves. Maybe though, at the top level, people will eventually find some sort of team comp that she perfectly fits into, and you don't need a damage amplification, you just need more ults to use your ult on cooldown. So we'll have to see what happens in the future. All in all though, guys, this is my tier list. I think that it's relatively accurate to what I've seen in the game. I've tried out almost all of these characters in the game at some point, tried how they felt, tried how their actual buffing worked. Some characters are way jankier than other ones, and that's something you really have to keep in mind. For instance, a character like Alto, even if Alto did 5 times the amount of damage, he has jankiness in his skill set, which makes him hard to use. And because of this, some of these characters are not as high placed as they might be. If you look at a damage chart and you just see, oh, Calcharo is doing as much damage as Jiyan, sure, he can do as much damage in a perfect scenario, but realistically, the game isn't so simple when you have to dodge a bunch of attacks, parry a bunch of attacks, and play perfectly and do rotations with other characters. That's why characters like Verina, Jiyan, and a character like Lingyang just are able to be so high up compared to some of these other characters. Also, you have to think about the future potential of some of them. But something that is really cool about Wuthering Waves is there's so many good 4 stars, and also the characters at B tier are still really insanely good and used all the time. I would say the characters in C tier and D tier overall a little bit weaker and maybe could use a bit of a buff in the game, but even then, they're still usable. There are still people that use these characters. Even some of the characters that are considered the worst in the game, such as Taoqi and Yuanwu, I actually see them used. I was even using Taoqi to pair with my Chixia. So even the characters that are considered bad still have potential in this game. So really, even though this tier list is overall talking about how good I think these characters are, you should really more follow your heart on a lot of them, rather than just only focus on, oh, they put them there, they put them there, they put them there, like that's all that matters. Like I have to follow, I only want to use the S tier characters. Because there's a lot more to this game than just pure power. Some people are able to play characters way better because of how their playstyle is, and while another character might not really mesh as well with you. So please keep that in mind when you're really looking at this. For instance, Jiyan, he requires no brain, and that's a huge benefit. But a character like Calcharo, even though you might say, oh, he's better DPS than someone like Chixia, maybe the way he plays isn't for you. So anyways, thanks a bunch for watching this. If you enjoy this, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you next time.